Hi, Kristen Atchison here, and we are talking about the environmental context for language learning. This is the third and final component in our language development series. So first, let's talk about pragmatics. So pragmatics is this practical and social side of language. It's concerned with how we engage in appropriate and effective communication. And as you would guess, because it deals with who you're talking to in your talking environment, the environment will play a role. So it's our understanding of social interaction and our rules of communication. So this is something that's going to be almost exclusively learned through this environmental context, through this exchange with other people. Pragmatics includes things like speech acts, which is using speech to control others and to get one's way. So example of that could be a request. Can you please pass me the mashed potatoes? It could be, please stop doing that. Can I have a hug? Things like that. Those are all kinds of speech acts. It's a way to control others and, again, get their own way. Discourse is our social speech, our conversation. And part of that is learning about turn taking. That when you're having a conversation, it's not a monologue. It is you take a turn, and then I take a turn, and we listen to each other. And what we see is over the course of development that the number of turns increases with age. So young kids have a much harder time with this back and forth. I know for an extended period of time, I keep telling my daughter, it's not a monologue. Conversations, we got to take turns. And again, we see that increase in age. There is more of this back and forth with age. Another part of pragmatics is social referential communication. And this is what we were talking about in that second lecture, when we're aware of the listener's cues and we change how we speak based on who we're talking to. So infant-directed speech, which we talked about in the previous lecture, is an example of social referential communication. We're changing how we're talking based on who we're talking to. And again, we don't do this stuff on purpose. We don't engage necessarily in social referential communication, sometimes explicitly. A lot of times it's implicitly, and we're learning through these things through our environmental context. So one of the ways that we learn our grammar is feedback from others. And feedback is usually a correction in response to an utterance that doesn't work out some way. So whether it's grammatically incorrect, the vocabulary is wrong, those sorts of things. Now we're going to talk about grammar here, so we're going to really focus on those grammar pieces. There's different ways that more expert speakers will give feedback. Sometimes one of the ways is expansions. So we add more to the child's statement. So a young child says, I want more. Oh, you want some more of the carrots? Okay, you can have more carrots. So repeating what they're saying and expanding on it. Recasts is if a child says something grammatically incorrect, restating that statement in a grammatically correct way. So I blew the bubble. Oh, you blew a bubble? Good job. So restating that statement with that correct use of that irregular verb. So that's restating that statement in a more grammatically correct way. And clarification questions are just what they sound like. I'm asking the child a question to clarify what they said. And all of this feedback from their environment helps the child develop their grammar, helps them develop their pragmatics, and helps them develop a really good basis of language and communication. So just like feedback is important for your assignments and for me as an instructor, feedback's really important to kids as well in their language learning. And we see, again, the better and the more constructive this feedback is, the better kids do. Now notice none of these were, now in that last sentence, you used the irregular verb for blow incorrectly. No, you just recast it and kids pick up on that information. Or you expand that and you give them access to a more correct statement, a more verbose statement. So none of these are really explicit corrections, like, hey, you did something wrong, let's fix it. But these are those environmental ways that we do it. And a lot of times adults are engaging in these things, again, without necessarily knowing they're doing it. This can be that component of social referential communication. So let's talk about the role of experience expressly in language development. So we'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail. So what language is being spoken will really influence language development and to some extent cognitive development. Socioeconomic status makes a matter. The amount of exposure to language is important. Remember, we talk about the better the input, the better the output. Well, the more exposure we have to oral and print stimulation, the better the output we have with those. And then we have two that are going to really focus on literacy and reading. So, first, the role of experience in language development. Language itself is an experience expectant skill. So the brain expects to develop language. Now, the brain doesn't know what language it's going to learn, doesn't know what language to expect. And so that's, again, why these infants are universal listeners. They are born with the ability to tell the difference between all these different languages. But what language is spoken is an experience-dependent skill. Are they going to just use one language? If so, which one? Which one is the brain going to tailor itself to? Is it going to speak more than one language? Great. Well, which ones? And so again, language itself is an experience expectant. The brain plans on learning a language. It has the system set up to learn language. But what language is learned is an experience-dependent skill. And we'll go through some research examples that will talk about this. So language development really begins before birth. I know we've talked about this kind of in passing before, but that at birth, infants prefer their native language over a non-native language. And then the native language is defined as what their biological mother was speaking. So we talked about how the auditory system's online about 7 months prenatal. Well, infants are hearing mom talk. They're hearing that language being spoken, and they get used to it, and they prefer listening to it at birth. So at birth, they're universal listeners in that they can still tell the difference between any speech sound in any language, although actually preferring the language of their speaker. So there's a video that I want you to watch. It's linked both on YouTube and on iCollege, and it is Workers' Native Language Preference Study. So this is a study where they show an infant, and you can see how they're using this suck paradigm to really see that the infant is preferring her native language over a non-native language. Again, infants are born as universal listeners. When I say that they can distinguish between different phonemes and across any language, phonemes are those speech sounds. And each language has its particular sounds, and they are different than other languages. If you've ever tried to learn a second language or pronounce words from another language, especially as an adult or as a late teenager, it's really, really hard. And there's some things that you can't ever pronounce the same way that someone else can. So you can listen to a native speaker and they'll say the difference between something. You're like, but that's what I'm saying. You can't hear that difference because you are no longer a universal listener. But again, babies are born able to distinguish between all phonemes and all languages. And there's another video that I'm going to have you watch. Again, it's linked on YouTube and on iCollege. And it's another study by Janet Worker, and it's called Ba-Da. And it shows that infants, even though they haven't been exposed to these phonemes in a different language, are really able to tell the difference between them. However, we really do have these critical periods for language. And this Pat Cole study shows that while we're born universal listeners, that starts to go away. The brain is going to have perceptual narrowing for language, just like we had perceptual narrowing for face perception when we talked about earlier in the course. So this perceptual narrowing is when the brain says, okay, well, I'm not getting any information about these other 50 languages. I don't need to be able to distinguish between those phonemes. I really need to focus on this one language that I'm hearing. And so the brain perceptually narrows, and what we see is that infants lose this ability to have this universal listening ability. However, in this critical period for language, if infants continue to be exposed to this language, then we don't lose that. We don't have that perceptual narrowing. So just like we saw in the the monkey study, when kids were given pictures of monkeys and got exposed to monkey faces, they didn't lose the ability to distinguish between monkey faces. The same thing happens for other languages. So infants who are traditionally have been exposed to English, if they're exposed to Mandarin Chinese in this critical period, again, we don't see that perceptual narrowing happening for Mandarin Chinese because they have this experience with it. So that's the last of those videos that I want you to watch. So it's again linked in iCollege and on YouTube. So if children are learning more than one language, if they're going to be bilingual or multilingual, what we see is that they can learn multiple languages simultaneously during childhood and during infancy. If an infant's being exposed to 2 languages at the same time, they're going to learn them both. We're not going to have that perceptual narrowing for either of those languages because they're being exposed to it. That experience is dependent on their brain development. It changes their brain development. What we see is that sometimes we'll see a little bit delayed speaking for those kids that are being introduced to these 2 languages simultaneously, but when they do, they're speaking 2 languages. We can also see that sometimes infants, if they're only being exposed to 1 language at the beginning, but before about 6 have been exposed to this second language, that they really still are in this critical period for language development and can still learn this second language to a level of a native speaker fluency. So we know that bilingualism, not outside of just having the advantages of getting to talk to more people and being able to communicate with twice the number of people, we also see that bilingualism has a lot of cognitive effects, a lot of cognitive benefits. So we see that it affects cognitive development in terms of kinds of executive function skills. So things like switching between tasks, which makes sense, right? If you have to switch between languages, your brain gets really good at switching. And so you're going to be better able to switch between tasks. We see another example, another cognitive executive function benefit is inhibition. If we see that improvements in that. If you're having to inhibit kind of the information in one language and focus on the information in the other language, again, it's giving kids kind of an edge up in these things. And we also see increased creativity, enhanced creativity. Think about it. Different languages have different ways of talking about things, and they have different words for different things. If you're given 2 or 3 times the amount of words, you have more ways to think about things, and you have more ways to be creative. So bilingualism really has these great cognitive effects in addition to just being able to speak multiple languages. Because of this, we're starting to see that school districts are starting to pay more attention to this. And now even public schools are starting to add some immersion classes in kindergarten, first grade, kind of starting kids that way. Some entire schools are public school immersion schools or dual language schools. And we see that this is really, really important. We do see also in the private sector, in the private school systems, there are immersion preschools where children can go and that's all they speak. They go to preschool and there's only that other language is being spoken. So my daughter went to a immersion Spanish preschool where that's all they spoke all day long was Spanish. We're not a Spanish speaking household, so that's not something that I can necessarily provide for her. But she did have that opportunity to go there. And now she's in the public school setting, and she doesn't have any exposure to Spanish in her normal school day. And so we pay for an after-school program where she has immersion, classes at least once a week to kind of maintain this, because she is still. When she started, she was really still in that critical period for language development, and now she's starting to get out of that. And so by maintaining her exposure to this, we're really increasing the ability that she'll be able to be fluent in Spanish. So let's switch on to literacy now. So emergent literacy is children's active efforts to construct literacy knowledge, but they're done through really these informal experiences. So this isn't sitting a kid down and teaching them to read. This is what kids learn about reading from their environment, okay? So from the environment they're in, through being read to, through exposure to print, these kinds of things, through playing with books. I like to think about it as kids' tool belt for learning language or learning how to read. So it's all the tools that they need so that when it is time to learn to read, they have all the tools at their disposal. And so kids who really have these really good emergent literacy skills, when it is time to learn to read, a lot of times there's not as much of a struggle because they understand kind of how books work. They understand how the direction that the words go. They've had exposure to these things. One of the ways kids do this is they read by memorizing stories. And another thing that they do is phonological awareness in this emergent literacy. Phonological awareness is, we talked about those phonemes, those different sounds of languages. It's the ability for kids to really reflect on those and manipulate those so that they understand that spoken language better. So rhyming books really are one of those things. And again, phonological awareness is going to be one of those tools in the tool belt for emergent literacy. We're going to see that that's an important skill. So, noticing that Jeep and sheep have those same long E's and the P sounds at the end, that they have those same sounds, but the beginning sound is different. Noticing those things will be really important. So here's a video of my daughter, quote unquote, reading. Clearly she just has this story memorized, and we'll talk about how we can really, the different emergent literacy stuff that's going on here.
Blamber, blamber, what do you see? I see. Tell me.
You tell me.
A bird looking at me. Webber, what do you see?
So you could see that she had it memorized, right? She's not even looking at the page, at the words. She's clearly not reading them. But she's also telling me, she's asking those same questions that we asked her in reading. That we were, by doing these informal experiences, she knew, hey, you look at the picture if you don't know what the words say. And that's going to be an important tool in learning to read. And so she looks down at the picture, it's a red bird. Red bird, what do you see? And so again, she's able to do these kinds of things before she can actually read. These are her emergent literacy tools that she can use. And so that when she did get into kindergarten, because this is before then, much before then, when she did get into kindergarten, she had all these tools in her tool belt to really start learning to read and had these kind of awareness about these different sounds. Early literacy is really experience-based. We know that the more literacy-related experiences kids have, the better their language, their spoken language, but we also see the better their literacy development, their ability to learn to read, and we also see that their later reading skills are also improved. So we know that the more kids have access to these reading-related experiences and to being read to, the better their language development. We also know this through intervention studies. So they've taken low socioeconomic child care centers who typically have poor emergent literacy skills, poor later literacy, these sorts of things, and they flooded these child care centers with books. And not only that, they taught the child care workers how to engage with these books, with these children. And what they saw was really these huge gains in emergent literacy development. And then we see those same kinds of better spoken language, better literacy development, and better later reading skills. So we know that this environment, this experience of being read to, an experience with books, really improves literacy. So, to that topic, Anne Van Cleek, who's a researcher at the University of Texas at Dallas, gives us 5 tips for sharing books with young adults. With children. So these are the things that the adults or the readers should do. They should serve as a child's bridge to understanding. So they should support attention and be responsive. So while encouraging the child to respond to the book, be responsive to when the kid doesn't want to be attending. When the kid doesn't seem to understand, be responsive to that child's needs. Really be that bridge to understanding the content of this book. And this is sharing books with young children and infants, because even though infants may not have language yet, we know that reading to them is just as important as it is reading to a 3-year-old. So we see these are as really, really important skills. Establish a reading routine. You want one that's really emotionally warm and fun, that's really engaging and enthusiastic. So think back to your intro class when you learned about conditioning and association learning. This is what we want. We want to develop a good association with reading. We want reading to be a fun environment. We want reading to be engaging. We want this association between this being a warm and snuggly kind of thing. And so, cuddling with a book and a child is great. Using those fun, silly voices is great. All of those things really create these associations between reading being a good thing, reading being something that they want to engage in, whether they're being read to or whether they're later being read to or later reading to themselves. It's also really important to focus on the meaning of the story, kind of the overall comprehension, and not teaching them to read. So unless really a child is showing interest in the alphabet and these sorts of things, with infants and young children, we really just need to focus on that comprehension of the story. Do you know what's going on here? And if not, be that bridge to understanding. Again, we're trying to, in reading to young children, we're not doing this to teach them to read explicitly. We're doing this to give them the tools so when they're ready to learn to read, that they have all the tools that they need. So again, we don't need to point out all the letters. We don't need to sound out the words because we're not doing that yet. We're giving them these more informal experiences that help them in their later ability to read. Really stay at the child's level. Adjust the books you choose and the language you choose to the child's level. So if a book is using vocabulary that your kid may not be, or the kid that you're reading to may not be familiar with, you can read the word that they say and then restate it and explain what that word means. You can choose different books depending on the level that child is at. So you don't read Harry Potter to a 3-year-old. A 3-year-old's not going to have the attention span to read Harry Potter. I know, I've tried. But you adjust to what that child is interested in and what the language that they understand. And it's really important to share different kinds of books because they foster different kinds of skills. So a nonfiction versus a fiction book, they have those for even babies. They have board books that are nonfiction books. We see rhyming books are going to have a different kind of skill than just a narrative kind of a text is. So these different skills, these naming books where it's like, there's a truck, that's a different kind of story. So these different kinds of books are really important because they foster different kinds of skills. Again, more details about this is linked on iCollege or on the link on the slide. The other thing that we do is, now we've talked about the emergent literacy skills, let's talk about actually literacy skills, so actually learning to read. So there's 2 main approaches that we're going to talk about in this course. There's other ones, obviously that would be more of an education course for you to focus on. But from a developmental perspective, there's 2 approaches we're going to talk about. One of which is the phonics approach, is where we kind of use that phonological awareness that we have to analyze those words and break down the sounds and really learn those relationships between the letters and the sounds, where the whole language approach really focuses on the whole word. It focuses on reading for meaning, and it uses the sight words and context as that basis for reading development. I personally blame my lack of spelling skills on this whole language approach. So I grew up in this, when whole language was the way reading was taught, and I'm a terrible speller. I did not get phonics, I did not get that, and the relationship between letter sounds is very complicated for Dr. Atchison. So again, reading, we know this phonological awareness is really important. Information processing speed is going to be important too. So taking that information, processing it, and being able to understand meaning. So all that stuff that we talked about in those earlier cognition chapters are going to be important as well. And we know that really practice contributes to these reading skills. So Even most elementary schools, they require students engage in a certain amount of reading per week because we know that practice is really, really important. The whole language approach really looks at language, learning how to read as mirroring natural language learning, so how they learn to speak. So we really need that full text to appreciate the function of written language, where phonics really looks at kind of the basic rules for translating written symbols into sounds. Well, the question is then, what works best? How do we teach kids to read? What we know from the literature now is that really the mix of these two things is important. Just doing whole language may result in terrible spellers, but just teaching phonics may not help with comprehension. So this combined environment where we have both phonics and whole language are really what we see have the best gains for children's reading ability. So now let's watch a video of a child that's learning to read.
On the words. Put your finger on the words. Now read it.
Dad had a hat.
Very good.
And he had a hat, a hat.
Very good. So where's Dad in the picture? Show me where Dad is.
Right here.
And he had a what?
Hat.
Okay, now where's Tad?
Right here.
And he had a what?
Hat.
Very good. All right, next
And
page.
there's the mommy one.
And there's the mommy cooking.
So here in this video, you could see there was both of those things going on, both phonics and whole language. So he sounded out those words, tad, had. He sounded those out. He was using his phonological awareness and his phonics skills to sound these words out. However, they instructed him on context and meaning and looking at the whole words. So mom goes back and says, okay, well, where was Dad? What is this? This word is referential. What is it? Where is he? And he had a what? And Ted, and where was he? So that we're really doing both this whole language, thinking about context, thinking about these whole words, but also paying attention to these phonological cues that really help children read as well. Now, mom had an extra boost because she was a first grade teacher, so she was expertly trained in teaching kids to read, and so she had an extra boost in teaching this little boy to read, but it's a really good video that demonstrates both of those things are involved here in learning to read. So the last thing that we're going to talk about in the environmental context for language learning is screen time. So the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no screen time, none, for children 18 months or younger. So babies should not be in front of screens, whether that be TV or iPads, any sort of tablet device, any sort of smartphone, any of these things. The only exception that the American Academy of Pediatrics makes is for video chat with relatives and loved ones, and it's not necessarily because they think that's beneficial. They just don't think that it's necessarily detrimental. And this recommendation really comes out of the literature from developmental psychology. So while it's the American Academy of Pediatrics, so it's medical doctors making these recommendations, this is really based on decades and decades and decades of developmental psychology research on screen time and language development. We know from Vygotsky that children really learn from social interaction. And one of the things that's happening is when children are exposed to media, that they're being taken away from that. So the more time they spend watching TV, the less time they're hearing someone actually speak to them. And we see that's problematic because the better the input, the better the output. And infants are not registering screen time as speech input because they're learning from that social interaction. So really, that engagement with a caregiver, a sibling, a parent, anybody is where children are learning language from. And again, reading to infants and toddlers is extremely beneficial because it is engaging in that social interaction. It is giving them exposure to language. It is giving them exposure to different kinds kinds of language. When you read a story, they don't use necessarily the same language that you would use speaking to your infant. That increases the diversity of vocabulary that they're presented with, the diversity of grammar that they're presented with. And so we really see that this is really great. We see that there's a strong correlation between reading to infants and toddlers and their later school performance. So we have this positive relationship where kids who are read to more have better school performance later on. And the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as psychologists, really recommend reading to children at least 20 minutes a day, infants and toddlers. Now, is that always easy to do? No. Did I always read to my daughter 20 minutes a day? No. Life intervenes. But you do your best. And children who have this high exposure to written language, again, we see them not only with these emergent literacy skills, but we also see them with better language development as a whole. So research really indicates that the more time spent watching TV as opposed to reading and interacting with peers and caregivers really leads to lower academic skills. We also see that educational programs for children above 18 months, so this is not for babies, this is for above 18 months, then we can have beneficial effects for pre-literacy skills. And that video and computer games are kind of a mixed bag. While we might see some benefits in selective attention and spatial skills, we're not going to necessarily see any benefits in terms of language development. Television as a whole, education has been educational programs related to gains in literacy, in math, and academic progress in elementary school. So we see things like Sesame Street as being really good. They did a study where children watched Sesame Street, and then they were later tracked in high school, and they saw that these kids read more books, got higher grades, and had a higher value on achievement in high school. So again, that's a strong predictive relationship. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends only the Sesame Street Workshop and PBS, these evidence-based children's educational media, for children over 18 months. So for this young children, so 18 months probably till about 6, they really recommend about no more than about an hour a day, and they really prefer that to be co-viewing. So parent is sitting with child watching, Sid the Science Kid, and talking about what's going on in Sid the Science Kid. So not only are they being exposed to this educational programming, but they're also still getting that language stimulation as well from their caregiver. And again, this is limited exposure. This is not sitting kid down in front of the TV all day long. And again, it's not realistic that every child will never watch more than an hour of TV a day. How would they ever watch a movie, right? But it's about moderation, right? So you don't watch a movie every single day. You make movies a special event. And so that, again, we have this more limited exposure with them. And know that movies are not going to promote language literacy, that screen time is actually time away from speaking, time away from that social interaction. We see that entertainment programs, so things like movies, things like, SpongeBob would be entertainment, where Nature Cat would be educational. These are different programs that are directed at children. And we see that these entertainment programs, these ones that don't have educational value, really detract from school success and social experiences. Notice that the American Academy of Pediatrics didn't recommend, Disney Channel. They were really recommending these programs that are evidence-based from PBS and the like, because they really have that higher level. These are programs on PBS that are getting federal grants, education grants, because they are evidence-based. Where Disney Channel, while they have some really cute shows, is trying to make money. So these are entertainment programs. And we see really in research that these really are detracting from school success and social experiences. Because in both situations, kids are getting less time with either a social experience or less time with language. And we know language is going to be related to their school success. Again, and I know I keep saying it, but the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no screen time before the 18 months of age. even educational programming. So even Sesame Street and all the wonderful content on PBS before 18 months is linked to lower language and cognitive outcomes in children. So there is no amount of screen time that is really okay for children 0 to 18 months. And again, this is because children are learning language through social interaction, and when they're in front of a screen, they're not getting that social interaction. And this includes programs that are directed at infants. So Baby Einstein, Your Baby Can Read. I don't know what the current stuff is that's directed at babies because it makes me too angry to look at. There's actually class action lawsuits that have been against these programming that's directed at infants. So if there is anything out there that is being directed at infants, I can guarantee you that there is currently a class action lawsuit pending. Both Baby Einstein and Your Baby Can Read lost their class action lawsuits, and both are no longer allowed to promote that these are educational because they actually are detrimental. And I think it was about 2010, Baby Einstein had to drop its educational, saying that it was educational for infants from their bylines and from their advertising, and they had to offer refunds to everyone who had bought a DVD under the guise of it being educational for their infant, because it is not. It is, in fact, linked to those lower language and cognitive outcomes. Your Baby Can Read was a thing that was around 2010, 2011. Again, they had a class action lawsuit against them, and they are no longer a thing because your baby cannot read. But again, these kinds of educational programs that are directed at infants, every single parent on the planet wants the best for their kids. Every single one. And when marketing is telling you that this is the best thing for your kid, it's easy to fall prey to that. It's easy to fall into the, oh, well, okay, I want my kid to learn. I want them to have that step up. I want that to be that step ahead. But again, before 18 months, even educational programming is actually detrimental. So for those little kids, those infants, the best thing we can do with them is interact with them, is to play with them, is to talk to them, is to read to them. And that's where we're going to see those step ups. Added bonus, those are a heck of a lot cheaper than DVDs and infant cable channels, which they've had, and, reading programs for infants, because, again, your baby cannot read. But, again, we really see that before 18 months of age, and I know I'm on a soapbox, and I know you guys are sick of hearing it, but before 18 months of age, there should be no screen time with the limited exception of video chat. Okay. I'm off my soapbox, and this concludes our lecture series on language development. Thanks.